This is a data analysis for Etowah High School by Ken Hoy, intended for administrators and science teachers at Etowah High School. The purpose of this data analysis is to start a discussion about data at Etowah High School by reviewing the end of course tests and then using those results to identify strengths and weaknesses, then create an action plan based on those strengths and weaknesses. I will examine the demographics of Etowah High School and specifically the science end of course data, biology end of course, and physical science end of course. I am a biology teacher. I've also taught physical science, and I've taught the what some students choose to take instead of biology, the Earth Systems course, which then leads on to biology. Student enrollment at Etowah High School for the past 4 years has remained rather constant. If you look at this carefully, this scale is only going from 240 and climbing up to 259, so only a 19 student difference in 14 years. Gone up and tailed back down, and I suspect it will be somewhere close to that this next year. We just haven't had a lot of in construction and whatnot around this area. The demographic data in regard to race and ethnicity for the past 4 years at Etowah High School, the vast majority of students are white. Around 1,750 students are white here at Etowah. And then the next biggest group, Hispanic, so hovering around 300 students each year, with a dip this the first year in 2014-15 on this data, and then staying rather constant around 300. And the African American population is hovering around 200 kids. When we have a few Asians, multiracial, one student that did not indicate. Demographic data in regard to gender, it is almost precisely a 50-50 split each year, and I believe in 16-17 it was exactly a 50% split. Favored the males, and then comes down and slightly favors the females in the 17-18 year. Our demographic data in regard to free and reduced lunch. Again, this looks like there's a big trend emerging here, but it really only goes from 24.1 up to 24.8, so a 7/10 jump here. Not a full percentage point, so not a big jump. It looks like this is a big jump in data, so this is slightly deceiving. So a slight jump up in the 15-16 and 16-17, and then coming back down slightly above 24%. So hovering very close in between 24 and 25%, which is not really shocking for Etowah. We have roughly one in 4 that are on free or reduced lunch. The demographic data in regard to mobility, our kids are moving at a clip of about 1 in 10 in the school. So about 10% of your kids will move during the course of the year. So at 14% in the 12-13 year, and then coming back down, hitting 10% in the 14-15 and 15-16 year, and then back in the 16-17 at 11%, about 1 in 10. In regard to graduation rates, you have the 14-15 in blue, the 15-16 in orange, and then 16-17 in the brownish color. And this data is Georgia, and this is Cherokee, hovering around 85 to 84%, and Etowah High School beats the Cherokee average, hitting 87 to 88% up here. So that is good that we're graduating almost 9 out of 10 kids in 4 years. This is a little disheartening that 1 in 5 kids at the state level are not graduating in 4 years. but at least we're beating that. All right, a summary of the data for the demographic data. Student enrollment has remained rather constant. Remember, a shift of only 19 kids. The vast majority of students are white, followed by Hispanic and then African American students. The gender ratio has hovered almost exactly at 50% for the past 4 years. The number receiving free and reduced lunch has hovered around 24% between 24 and 25, and between 10 and 12% of our students typically move during the course of the year. The 4-year graduation rate is 87 to 88%, which is above the county average and state average. The Georgia milestones are given in English, language arts, mathematics, social studies, and of course science. I'm a biology teacher, so I'm well acquainted with the end of course tests in biology, and I've also taught physical science. I'm going to address specifically the end of course test for biology and physical science. The end of course test for science and the biology end of course test for Etowah from the 14-15, 15-16, I'm going to skip 16-17, the 17-18 is all very consistent, beating the state average by about 40%. So there is a gap here of 40% on all 3 of these years. There is a weird anomaly that exists here where the state is staying really consistent, and so are we for 3 of the 4 years, but something worked to close that gap in the 16-17 year for us. It'd be interesting to go back and see what might have occurred there, but every year beating the state average, 3 of the 4 years beating it by about 40%, which is really good. Not for the state, but for Etowah, of course. Drilling that down a little bit, here is where the scores for Etowah came from. Had 20% or less, with a lot less being in this last 17-18 year, scoring in the beginning percentile. A decent amount, but slightly diminishing, especially in this last year, in the developing area. The biggest category was the proficient range, with approaching 50% and then climbing above 50%, getting to 55% in this last year that scored proficient, and then the distinguished getting upwards of 15% in that final 17-18 year, which is really good, seeing that climb up slightly. And seeing this diminish slightly. I do want to come back and address this gap here later on, and I'll talk about what might have occurred right there. The state data for biology paints a little bit of a different picture, with a lot of kids at this beginning level. Roughly a third or more of these kids are not understanding the standards. Not a great situation here, where Etowah's, remember, was down in here, so a big disparity between the state and Etowah, and a percent developing, still a big number here, so very lopsided to the not mastering the standards side. So the vast majority are lopsided over here, and still a decent amount proficient, and above 5% distinguished for the state. Looking at those two trends together paints a picture on this side for Etowah, with very few kids, relatively very few kids at the beginning level, still a lot of kids in the middle, in this range up here at the proficient range, pushing a lot of kids to proficiency, and then a decent amount in distinguished. With the state, they have way too many kids year after year that are not mastering the standards and are still at the fledgling beginning level. Interesting here with these numbers is these students are either going over here and increasing this, and a few of them may be coming over here and pushing these numbers up. But for Etowah, the kids that are here aren't moving down, they're moving up, okay, based on those numbers, which is good. Not for the state. The biology end of course data summary. Etowah clearly surpasses the state average on biology end of course tests, 3 of the 4 years being at 40% and an average about 35% over the state. An anomaly does exist in the 16-17 year. The percentage scoring in the beginning range was steadily declined at Etowah over the past 4 years, which is really good. And the trend percent proficient and percent distinguished shows a slight increase over the past 4 years. Really good again. And a comparison between the state data and Etowah depicts two different. Going on to the end of course test for physical science from the 14 to 18 school year. There is no data for Etowah for the 17-18 school year, and I'll talk about that in a moment. But every year in the 14-15, 15-16, and 16-17 school years, Etowah surpassed the state average. And you notice the state has stayed really consistent, tapering off and then plateauing here. And then it looked like Etowah was on a really good trend. And perhaps if that would have continued, maybe we'd be up in this range, you know, getting above 60% of our kids being proficient or above, which would be really pretty good. But as it stood, we're sitting around 50% that are doing okay on the test, and of course 50% that weren't, which was not. The EOCT science data for physical science by category. Again, with these two categories beginning and developing being pretty big together, you have 25% sitting here, and you have, you know, roughly another 35% sitting here. You have your vast majority of at least half of your kids not being proficient on the test. Okay, and these are the state results. Again, plateauing pretty much here, not pushing the kids up year after year. There is a slight trend in that yellow to push towards the middle, and even to get more distinguished learners in the state, which is a little bit of a silver lining, but way too many students beginning and developing throughout the state. Looking at those two trends together, a slightly different trend emerges here, where Etowah has more students in the middle, and the state is having more students here lagging behind, not getting to that proficient mark, and neither one having many distinguished learners for sure. So some similarities, but this tail end here is a little disturbing for the physical science end of course test data summary. Etowah surpasses the state average on the biology on the physical science end of course test, but not as impressive as it did with the biology. About 50% do not understand the standards or are below the proficiency mark. Most of the Etowah students fall in the middle two ranges, which does not follow the typical Georgia trend. And a comparison between the state data and Etowah depicts two different trends. For a discussion, all 4 years, Etowah High School scored better than the states. On average, Etowah High School scored 36% better than the state average in biology and about 13% better in physical science. That, of course, is a strength. And also, we've been able to dramatically decrease the number of students scoring in the lowest category over the past 4 years, especially so in the biology arena. Weaknesses, same thing. We have been able to dramatically decrease the number of students scoring in the lowest category of the past 4 years. Doesn't sound like a weakness, but here's what happened. We noticed that 50% of the students were not meeting the proficiency level and wanted to do something. And instead of having them take physical science, we decided to have them take physics later on to meet that requirement. So we eliminated physical science, and those kids now are typically put into Earth systems and then take biology a year later. So that affected it twofold. Number one, it took away the data for physical science, and it also took those kids away from biology for a year. So they will be shielded from biology for an extra year. So what would have typically been your lower end kids will not be taking that test 1 year, because they will be taking the Earth Systems course, which has no end of course test. And so there'll be a little bit of an anomaly both of those years when those kids are not taking the end of course test. And of course, when they come back to taking the test, it'll shift back the other way as well. They will have that extra year, but you'll see a little bit of flip-flopping in the data. So that indeed is a weakness, because we've shielded those kids from that test, which is going to make our data look a little strange. And remember, I pointed out 2 places where the data had jumped a great deal, and that was likely because we had shielded those kids from taking those tests and took out those typically lower scores, and put them in another class entirely. Okay, about 50% of the students did not understand the physical science standards, and that's the reason why we did it. We just were not being successful year after year, and felt that if they took those physical science standards later on, that the math would not be as hard for them. And so they will take their physical science class as physics, not a hard physics class, but they'll take it as a physics class later on down the road. And is there a clear correlation between the shift in classes and the change in scores? I think there is. It'll be interesting to see how those scores play out in the future, and see if they can actually do better later on. Of course, there isn't an end of course test for physics.